I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
And I'm Matt Bernko. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
This week we are talking to Damian Costello, who's the author of a book called Black Elk, Colonialism And Lakota Catholicism from Orbis Books. And really excited to learn a little bit more about that. Make sure to listen to the past episode. We're going to say that a bunch of other times during the next conversation. But make sure to listen to the past episode where Damian interviews Basil Braveheart. It's a good kind of context-setting episode, I think, for this one. But before we do that, Matt, I hear that we have 2 iTunes reviews.
Yep, we got 2. All right, so this is a little bit different than our usual iTunes rating segment in that we've gotten our first 1-star review.
I'm very excited about
it. So since, usually we wouldn't probably read bad reviews at all, but if it's the first 1 star, we got to take that criticism,
No, I'd read them.
Can't
read
just
them all.
ignore it.
You gotta be fair and balanced.
Exactly.
No
so here's the
spin
balance.
zone here.
No spin zone. Okay, this review is entitled Terrible. 1 out of 5 stars.
Referring to the review, though.
Yeah, they're saying that their own review is terrible. Okay, so this user writes, they frown on evangelization and can't really talk about theology or the Bible. True, all true. Not going to dispute that. Marxism, though, they are really passionate about Marxism. Also true. And again, this is only the obvious. They are very dismissive of the strong currents of atheism and opposition to Christianity within the Marxist tradition. False? We did kind of a few episodes about that, actually.
Yeah, I agree. That's just some unfair selective listening.
Yeah, I think so. Like the whole episode on Lenin was about that.
Yeah, or the Bakunin one.
Yeah, that's true. Dang, man. Good. We're good at this.
Yeah.
Okay, and then they conclude their review saying, I really wish there was a good podcast about leftist politics and Christianity, but I'm still looking for one. And honestly, me too. I wish there was a good podcast about leftist politics and Christianity. And I hope if that person has listened to this episode, which they probably haven't, if you ever find one, please tell us what it is. Okay, so there's our 1-star review. Partly accurate, 1 bit of selective listening. But fine.
Should have at least been 2 stars. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, if there's 80 episodes, like it's a lot of time. Even.
Yeah, it's like three whole days of your life.
Good God, it's bad. Sorry, I won't say good God because we don't talk about the Bible or theology. Okay, another person writes, maybe this is the pick me up that we all need after that very devastating blow. Another person writes, it's a good show, 5 out of 5 stars.
That's what I'm talking about.
That's what I want. That's the kind of feedback we need. All right, so this user writes, longtime listener, first-time reviewer, 5 stars prompted because of that hot production on the Prison Chaplain episode.
Nice.
Woo. All right.
It was good. It's a good one. I
put considerable time into it. Yeah, and then they also continue to write, intro beat coming back in, hyping me up, getting me ready to protect my friends.
Nice. Yeah,
good.
I listened to that episode and I was like, man, what podcast is this? Where can I sign up for this?
Yeah, it's really fun. It was a cool exercise. I partly did that because all of my students are making more like documentary style podcasts, and I wanted to make one too, just to show them that I could. So I did. And it's good. It was a fun thing. It's definitely a different way of thinking about audio that I really like, actually. So maybe I'll do another one in the future, next time I have a chance to do a cool interview with somebody.
Yeah. I mean, if we didn't make a podcast every single week, like maybe we'd put more time into it, but too bad.
No kidding. Yeah, exactly.
We got a 5 out of 5 review out of it, though, so worth it.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. So you too can write a review of our podcast if you want to. You can just go on over to iTunes, go to rate this podcast, and then give us 5 out of 5 stars, or give us 1 out of 5 stars, but probably don't. Probably just give us 5 out of 5. Get on that. We need more of these reviews. We've kind of got off the review reading track, and maybe we can get back on with some of your help.
That's right. Maybe this next conversation will inspire you to give us a 5 out of 5 star review. So how's that for a segue? Let's turn it on over to Damian Costello to talk about Black Elk. All right, this week we are here with Damian Costello, author of the book Black Elk, Colonialism and Lakota Catholicism from Orbis Books. Really thankful to have Damian with us today. Make sure to, maybe before listening to this one, go back and listen to an interview that we hosted that Damian did with Basil Braveheart last week. That'll kind of help contextualize some of our conversation here. The book deals with Black Elk, who you will learn a lot more about in the next hour, and we're going to sort of see what it might look like to think of indigeneity and colonialism and Catholicism and all those kind of things together. But before we jump into that, let's do a little catching up. So, Damian, what have you been up to lately in the last week or so?
Well, I just got back Sunday from close to your territory, south of Grand Rapids. I was in South
Nice.
We went up to there, took a class up to see some Pokagon historical sites on this very topic, Catholicism and Native American tradition. But I'm mostly a stay-at-home dad, and the kids were sick when I got home, and so that's been a little tough. Mom is away at a conference as well, so me and the kids.
Cool, yeah, that sounds pretty wild. This whole stay-at-home dad thing, I don't have any contextualized experience to relate to apart from, chasing my 2 cats while my wife is at work. But that sounds like a lot of work. Anyway, glad you got to see Michigan. Matt, what have you been up to?
Just taking it easy over here, teaching classes, grading papers. That's about it. Not anything crazy. Yeah. What about you, Dean?
I've been busy, super busy, writing a lot, trying to get things in order to do my comprehensive exams for my PhD next week or next month. Next week's a little too optimistic, I think. So hopefully that'll go well. I finished like a course proposal on Christianity and the left in the US and Canada, hoping to run that pretty soon. So it's been like a lot of organization this past couple of weeks, but all good things, I think.
Cool. Sounds good.
I have to say, one of the downsides of having a guest like me is that I tend to interrupt all the cool banter that you guys have, listening to your old episodes. It's quite a show sometimes.
That's okay. I don't think your interrupting would hurt any of our banter. I'm sure it's going to be just fine.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think those 5-star reviews are coming from the banter personally, but who knows? Well, let's get into why you're actually here, Damian. Last week, like we mentioned, we hosted your interview with Basil Blackheart, and he gave a lot of kind of interesting insights into Black Elk and Lakota Catholicism, and it was really good to hear some of that. Is there anything, just before we start off here, that you want to highlight from that interview or follow up on, maybe as a way to kind of set the stage for what we're about to talk about?
Well, I guess I'd like to reiterate what you said to the listeners. If for some reason you only have an hour of your life to give to this topic, I'd say turn this off and go back and listen to that interview. Basil Braveheart, he's really the spiritual heir of Black Elk's spiritual legacy. Everything from his early childhood in his grandparents' cabin in the 1930s, where he got his Lakota spiritual base. His decades as a traditional spiritual leader. He's a participant in the Catholic world, goes to mass every day, and he's a real theologian in terms of the way he's trying to bring together Lakota tradition, Christian theology, and quantum physics. It's hard for me to keep up with him sometimes. He's really a priceless voice when we think about something like Black Elk.
So yeah, it's definitely a cool interview. It's really interesting to hear it come from him, kind of as like a source. It is great that you were able to conduct that interview. It seems like it'll be something that's worth something to the future of like Lakota Catholicism. Well, usually on the Magnificast, whenever we read a book or an article on the show, we always ask the author to give us a little bit of an elevator pitch about what the book is about. So could you tell us what it is that you wanted to accomplish with your book, and maybe just a little bit about who Black Elk is and like why he's important to you?
Well, Nicholas Black Elk was a Lakota holy man. He was made famous by the book Black Elk Speaks. He was at a lot of the big events of Lakota and Native American history. Battle of Little Bighorn when he was about 12 years old. He finished off a couple soldiers, and then he was at Wounded Knee, fought in the aftermath there, Ghost Dancer, traveled to Europe with Buffalo Bill Cody. And as a young boy, the most important thing is he had this great vision. He was in a coma for 12 days, but his spirit was brought up into the sky, and he met all these different figures in the Lakota religious world, all these different spirits. And he was commissioned to save his people and to establish the sacred tree at the junction of the Red Road and the Black Road. And so he spent his whole life trying to discern what that meant, how he was going to be an intercessor for his people. Now, I discovered Black Elk pretty much like everybody up until a year or two ago, before the canonization process started. I was an undergraduate, small school, Mount St. Mary's College in Maryland. And I spent most of my time, when I should have been studying, pulling books off the library shelf. And I was interested in Indigenous studies, and I found that book, and I was blown away by it, for its view into Native American culture. And I think we all kind of circle around a few questions, big questions when we're academics that we always sort of return to. And for me, the question was always about conquest. How does that happen? Why does that happen? The sort of questions that Jared Diamond dealt with in Guns, Germs, and Steel that came out after I was an undergraduate. So as somebody who's a theologian, then the question was always, okay, well, how did Christians do this? It makes sense if, the Mongol Empire or something did this, because of course they're bad pagans. But how did we good Christians do this? And so Black Elk Speaks really encapsulated all these questions that I had as an undergraduate. But I didn't have any idea he was also Catholic until I brought the book into one of my theology classes, sort of accidentally, and the professor saw it, and he looked at me and he said, "Hey, did you know that guy was Catholic?" And of course, I had no idea. I didn't know at the time much about Native American culture, and didn't really think that natives could be Christian as well. And so he said, "Well, this is a really interesting debate. Why don't you study this? You can do a senior project and write a paper about it." And so I did. Fall of '97, I read everything there was out there about Black Elk at the time, and it was the best educational experience I ever had in my life. And when I returned to grad school, I revisited it, and that's the basis of what became this book.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I think it's interesting too to how you narrate that story of starting off with someone who kind of has internalized a lot of the assumptions about what it means to be a Native person or something like that, and through Black Elk having those things challenged, and that's something that comes through in your book as well. the figure of Black Elk challenges all kinds of assumed narratives, not only about indigenous people in the United States and about Christianity in general, but also about Black Elk himself. I think that's really fascinating. And in the first chapter, you frame the position of the book coming from a post-colonialist, and a post-Western Christian perspective. So those positions add some kind of interesting nuances to the project. Could you maybe introduce like what those words mean and how Black Elk helps you think through those kinds of issues?
Sure, but before I do that, I have to say that my biggest fear in thinking about joining you guys in this podcast was realizing, man, my academic, my theoretical chops are just not at the level where your guys' level is. You know, I think maybe they were back when I was in grad school, but having moved on, that seems like a very distant world. But having said that, post-colonial thought allowed me to open up a lot of space for Black Elk. You know, the colonial world is really good at dividing things into hard binaries, you know, very much like all Western modern thought. So you have settlers and natives, and one is sort of ultimately good and smart and has the right culture, and then the other side is everything that's bad. And, you know, that kind of flips at times, but that's how colonial thought tends to view the world. Post-colonial thought tries to blur those distinctions and focus more on practices and the gray area. Now, I should say, if you really want a full explanation of this, you should go back and listen to Michael Jimenez, his episode 46. You know, I was listening to that, and if you go to about 21 and a half minutes, he will break it down in a very sophisticated way. So then in regards to post-Western Christianity, I think it's a little less well-known and probably more important for Black Elk. Part of the colonial legacy is that we still think of Christianity as being European, or even when it gets moved to other places, that it's still a European thing at its core. And, you know, if you just look at the facts of it, most Christians today live in places that are not North America or Europe, you know, Africa and Asia, Latin America, and that trend is only expanding. But I think our conceptual framework really hasn't caught up to what that means when, you know, post-Western Christian theorists, and I'm thinking of La Manzana, he was very influential, or Vincent Donovan, a very good book, Christianity Rediscovered. He has more of a narrative about this. When Christianity goes to a new culture, it's not just a matter of translating some ideas, right? You know, we think of the biblical text or a list of dogmas maybe in a Catholic sense, and they get translated, but a new culture is formed. A new perspective on the faith is opened up. They see things that we have never seen, and there's a sort of backflow into the church. You know, it's usually less individualistic, less dualistic than our tradition. You know, they haven't been arguing about Kant and Descartes for the last few centuries, and it'll probably emphasize different practices, and oftentimes there are things that we are uncomfortable with or have sort of quote unquote evolved out of, like maybe healing practices or exorcism. And so in looking at Black Elk, that allowed me to look at his Catholic life in a new way. A lot of commentators get sort of stuck, and I think, you know, if they're not theologians, it's hard for them to see this, that in order for Black Elk to be a full participant in the Catholic tradition, it doesn't mean he's going to look exactly like what we imagine Catholics to be, which is often sort of modern North American Catholics. It's not a switch of worldviews. You know, like they can't believe that he switched completely from a Lakota worldview to a Catholic worldview. That's impossible to do. Well, of course that's impossible to do. Nobody does that. What's happening is a new culture is being born, and part of investigating Black Elk is trying to figure out, okay, let's be respectful and honest about what this new culture is. And understand that first. And so both of these sort of theoretical arms helped me to, I think, be fairer to Native Christians in their own environment, and not impose what we often do. I mean, we still do this no matter how hard we try, our categories on them.
I think that's a really cool addition, or that's a really cool contribution that you can make, or that you have made to sort of post-colonial theory, and especially for Christians who are thinking through post-colonialism and colonialism. I know that I've said this on the podcast before, and I'll say it again. Like in my local church, I'm part of our mission team, and we have to figure out what does that look like for a local church who wants to give money to missionaries? Like, does that play off into all of the tropes of colonialism, or is there like a good way to do it and a bad way to do it? And the first chapter or so of your book really helped me think through that in a little bit more of a dynamic way. So I find that pretty interesting. Introducing the idea that the people who are colonized actually have agency is something that, is like stupid, but completely a blind spot of my own. Like it seems like it should be obvious that that's the case. But I think that sometimes in the discourse of colonialism, we do get kind of blinded to that. And so anyways, the idea of agency was a really big deal for me in your book. So I want you to unpack that idea of agency just a little bit more. You talk about considering Black Elk not as sort of like a passive Lakota person, just accepting Christianity pushed on him, but someone who has, agency and power, and they can do something with this Christianity. And they can, make their own decisions in their life, and they don't have to sort of remove them from their culture. So could you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what does it mean to think about agency in a context like this? Or what does agency just in general mean for this post-colonial situation?
In the first place, I think it's the right instinct to be in a place where agency is hard to see, because these, colonial practices, this huge apparatus, it's a powerful hegemonic force, and it's hard to see agency in the face of that. There are so many stories where it's difficult to see agency. But having said that, when you dig a little bit deeper, you find the ways in which people survive in forms that's not just outright resistance. The easy way to think about is the ways that people escape the system or seemingly beat the system. And those are few and far between, of course. But there's a lot of things that people do in their daily life to negotiate these systems, to use their agency. And so particularly when we think about identity, so much of this system, the colonial system, is artificial. It's hard to underestimate that, the force that it has on shaping identity, like residential schools, bad missionary work, salvage anthropology, movements for cultural renewal. They all sort of box people into the idea that the only legitimate way to not be a victim is to be traditional. And people still in that context have the ability to make choices and selectively adapt new practices that often, under the surface, sort of continue with traditional concerns or practices in a new form. So, out west where I used to live, rodeo is a really big thing on the various reservations out there. And on the surface, you look at it, you're like, oh, well, this is cowboy culture, right? What's more cowboy and Old West than the rodeo? But when you start to think about what's going on, you can see how this was a way for traditional native horse culture to survive in a new venue, in a new situation. It's a place where natives can interact with non-natives in relative on an equal footing, where bridges can be built, and it's a very vibrant culture in which natives invest in, just like your average settler cowboy. And so when you look at religious practices or something like Christianity, you can see sort of the same thing going on. Are there also instances in which things are shoved down people's throats and there's not much choice involved? Of course. But there's also ways in which people take practices that are new, that seem to be foreign, but inhabit them in a way to create a new future, survival, but also a way for their traditional practices to be a part of their thriving in the present, in the future.
Yeah, that ambiguity that you call attention to there between, on the one hand, it's a sense of survival, and on the other hand, it opens up different possibilities, potentialities. I think is something that's really hard to parse out and really important to call attention to as well. Maybe one example that we could use to get into this a little bit is how you talk about Jesuit missionaries in your book historically. And you sort of lay out an account of how they're somewhat different from other colonizing groups or interests like, merchants or the army, etc. And you say that you admit that they're complicit in colonialism for sure. But you say that there's also a way in which they're somewhat separate from it, or they find ways to resist it on their own terms as Jesuits. You use the term of them being in kind of a third way. And in our conversations about this book, Matt and I's, this is something that we kind of struggled with a little bit, I guess. So you cite all the ways that Jesuits give a particular respect to the Lakota people by learning their language, for example, or trying to find certain, I guess, cognates in their own worldview. But do you think that do you think it's really the case that the Jesuits are in that sense kind of separate from colonialism, or are they also, I guess, more complicit maybe than you might give them credit for in your chapter? Regardless of how enculturated they were, their end goal is still a certain kind of assimilation of Lakota people into Christendom in the American West. So yeah, I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit more of what you think of that, and with that ambiguity, is Lakota Catholicism sort of making the best of a bad situation with colonialism? Is there something more going on? How does that kind of history maybe help illuminate some of that?
I feel like you're pulling your punch a little bit, and that's okay.
I am for sure.
If I look back, right, and I do look back at this book, it's been over 10 years, and that's the part I struggle with the most as well. And I think there's a few reasons why I do look at it differently and would write this differently now. The whole Indian residential school question was really not on the average person's mind right now. It probably still isn't on the average person's mind, but there's a huge truth and reconciliation movement in Canada. I think it's much more prominent in the U.S., even though we're not in the same place. And even though I knew about residential schools, I don't think that I inhabited the space where I was able to take it, to feel it as palpably as I do now. And I think, I didn't have that experience living in a Native community long term. And that has really sort of helped me to understand these things in a different way. I'll get back to that later on. But I think probably the biggest thing that was going on as I look back was sort of this grad school tunnel vision that I had. One of the greatest things I think about your conversations that you guys have is your autobiographical honesty. And I can remember listening, I think it was, I have it written down here somewhere, I don't know where it is, but your episode on Jacques Ellul.
Oh, yeah. Christianity
and Anarchism, I believe it is, or Anarchism and Christianity. And, you talked about it, you brought up a lot of sort of problems that you now see with the work that you didn't necessarily see when you first picked it up. And I could be reading into this, but it sort of worked you into a frenzy a bit, got you on the board to the movement. And for me, I think it was, Harawas was sort of percolating around when I was thinking about these questions. This is the early 2000s, the Iraq war is going on. Everyone's sort of losing their mind. And Harawas was a very prominent voice in my education. And back then, I think I really believed, his claim that there really was a true, pure church out there, either to be found or created. And I was kind of looking at the Jesuits, looking for those remnants maybe. I don't think I would have said, oh, it was there. But looking through that lens, I think I heightened, my portrayal of the Jesuits in a positive way, in a way that I wouldn't do now. So, right now I think I'm in the Jose Miranda space. You guys talked about that work, and I don't know if I just happened to listen to those 2 episodes back to back, but if I remember correctly, you gave him a lot more credit in nuancing things and being faithful to both the communist tradition and the Catholic, the biblical tradition. And I'm really consciously trying to do that in my work as I go forward with Black Elk or with anything, evolving out of that tunnel vision into a much more open space. So, I would never now talk about the Jesuits being separate from colonialism. Maybe I didn't quite say that, but I'm sure that, the tone that you're describing is very accurate in the space that I inhabited. And I'm definitely much more sympathetic, and part of me sometimes agrees with more radical critiques like Charlotte Black Elk, who sees the church as really just an extension of greater colonial power, especially as time goes on. And there's a real distinction here where the later Jesuits didn't do the types of things the early Jesuits did, and more self-consciously modeled themselves as colonial agents. So, having said that, I don't want to lose the middle ground that the early Jesuits did inhabit. There's some great examples, like the Lakota wouldn't refer to them as white men. They were this different category. And, even today, you can find people who may have major issues with the church, but still talk very affectionately about various Jesuits or other missionaries that really did live a middle ground. And even if they didn't understand their complicity with colonialism, did practical things in their life that were different than what the colonial apparatus wanted. And then, finally, just, it's having lived in that experience and realizing how much more difficult it is to not only imagine what a heroic stance would be, but the difficulty of embodying that, what a radical and difficult place that is to live in an anti-colonial way long-term. So wanting to give them credit for that halfway, that middle space that, even though didn't go all the way, is incredibly difficult to inhabit. And, also thinking about John G. Neihart, the author of Black Elk Speaks, the one who interviewed Black Elk and wrote Black Elk Speaks. I'm pretty critical of him in the way he wrote Black Elk Speaks, the way he shaped the interviews through his own lens. As time goes on, I'm becoming much more appreciative of the work he did, to assert himself, to go out to Pine Ridge, to find Black Elk, to do the interviews. It's still problematic, the end result, but I have great respect for what he was able to do, given the limitations of his location.
I really appreciate how you reflect on that, Damian. I mean, I think you wrote this book a long time ago, so it's natural for anybody to kind of keep on developing and changing positions, etc. But I think it's actually a challenge to critically investigate the ways in which your scholarly assumptions continue to shape the work that you've done. I was saying to Matt when we were coming up with these questions, I don't think I've ever read anything that I wrote 10 years ago, and I sort of shudder to think what I would find if I tried to. Dealing with issues like colonialism and that sort of a thing, especially as a white scholar trying to make sense of this, I think it's I guess I'm just I'm happy to hear the kinds of extra thoughts that you have about it, and I'm curious to see where the rest of it takes you. Maybe we could kind of talk a little more about some other items like this in your book. Not like problems per se, but just ways where you try to draw out this ambiguity and where we could kind of keep on thinking about it a little bit more together. Matt, I know there's a passage that you wanted to pull out, so maybe I'll let you introduce that bit.
Yeah, totally. So this isn't exactly the same question that Dean asked, but it has a similar sort of feel to it, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say. So in chapter 7 of your book, you do this really cool analysis about, the ways that Christians, or like the ways that people who are in indigenous situations like do something with Christianity, and I really love that. I really love seeing the ways that that Christianity, like, maybe in a bad and colonial situation, opens up a space for them to do something that's a little bit revolutionary, or at least, is counter to the hegemony. And that's a cool thing to see. You pull out a few different examples. The one that really sticks out to me is Rastafari. That's a cool thing. So on that point in chapter 7 of your book, you say this. I'll just kind of read it here. Given the strategy the West employed to reorder the world, I maintain that when colonized people, quote, discovered Christianity, they often used it to counter the West. So, you use an analysis of Rastafari, but also of the Lakota Catholicism of Black Elk, to talk about that, to talk about the ways that they ended up countering the West. So your judgment in this book, I don't think, is altogether wrong on that point. The people of Jamaica and the Dakotas did do something with Christianity that countered colonialism in some pretty interesting ways, and we see sort of the history of that here. However, I'm wondering that that countering is never something that overcame Western hegemony, though. So is the countering that we see in these types of movements a difference that makes a difference? Is it a countering that really challenges hegemony, or is it a countering that just like makes a space for them to sort of survive?
Man, I have to say, this is like the best conversation I've had about this since I wrote the book. And I really appreciate you guys having it with me. It's probably the latter. I think my language here is in part kind of a product of that grad school tunnel vision, where we think we identify the monsters and we build them up, and we think we can find a way to just sort of slay them in some dramatic way. Did the Rastafari and Lakota appropriation of the gospel end Western hegemony? I mean, no, but nothing has. I don't know ultimately what will.
Communism didn't either. So,
but I think these pockets of survival are significant. I think they're pockets that did something meaningful for the people there, but they also produce these rich sort of cultural strands that spider web out into the world. And I think those spider webs, sure, I think they're commodified and domesticated, whether it's, Black Elk Speaks, say like Bob Marley, that's sort of on that trajectory. But I think it does considerable work in shaping people like me who find themselves interacting with them. I don't know if I ultimately have any great answers, but I think I am different and the world is different because I encountered Black Elk Speaks and listened to Bob Marley. And it shaped me to be attentive to these things, these issues and these histories in a way that I probably wouldn't have if those pockets did not survive and interact and produce these very interesting things. And, in giving up the possibility of discovering some sort of ultimate way to bring down hegemony, I think this is still a meaningful difference that does make a difference. And a lot of times I'm like, well, I'm not sure exactly what that difference amounts to. But a lot of the beauty that I'm able to see in the world comes out of those strands that have communicated across thousands of miles and decades and centuries.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good read on the situation. when I read those accounts from your book, I guess I thought of them as akin to what we've talked about on this show as like the Diggers or Thomas Munzer, right? They're real Christian movements that, are, definitely Christian, first of all, but also that do something in the face of hegemony that's pretty good, right? And that they don't bring down Western hegemony is, not surprising because, like, we just said nothing did, not even communism. So there you go. But I think they are helpful moments of recall. That's how I read them, at least, is just like one more thing in that long list of sort of like Christian radicalism that we can pull from.
Yeah, I think that's also a great way for us to maybe talk a little bit more about Black Elk specifically, and some more of what you've kind of been working with, Damian, and kind of thinking through who Black Elk is and what his life means. So you do a lot of work in your book to think through moments in Black Elk's life, whether it's like a major kind of vision that you mentioned at the top of this podcast, or his own kind of historical moves and shifts and changes. And I think that's really, at least for me, that was like the most exciting parts of the book, is like the way that you kind of lay out how Black Elk is like taking this material and like using some of it, not using other parts of it, combining it with other things. It's a really kind of creative act and an attempt to be faithful to a lot of different parts of his life. And that's like a really inspiring and challenging thing to do. It's like, it's something that everyone has to do, not just like Indigenous people, obviously. And the way that you trace how Black Elk does that is just really valuable. So I guess, you alluded earlier, you've spent some time living in Indigenous communities and thinking a lot more about this. And I wonder, does that experience, how has that experience, I guess, made you think a little more about Black Elk's life and enter into some of that space and understand it a little bit differently? You talk a lot about Black Elk's vision, and that's probably the thing that I'm most curious about. But yeah, anything that kind of comes to mind in light of that experience of having dug into that lived experience a little more.
Well, one of the funny things about this, I wrote the Black Elk book over 10 years ago, and it seemed like for a long time that was, firmly a part of my past, that I wouldn't really ever revisit it. And it was sort of accidental. My wife, she's a doctor, and when she got done with residency, she said she wanted to go out west and work on a reservation. And I was not interested in that. I was ready to come home. We're both from Vermont, and I was ready to start settling down. I wanted our family to be from here. And it was her turn to pick, so we ended up on the Navajo reservation in a pretty remote place and very far from any tenure track possibilities. And our kids were born out there, and I stayed home with them. And so the only thing I really had to do, which was also providential and perfect for this material, is to just go into the community and be a part of it as much as possible and go to ceremony. So for about 5 years, that's what I did. Stayed at home with the kids and then went to ceremony, all the different traditions that are there. Azeh Be Nahaga, which is the peyote religion, then the traditional Navajo ceremony, and there was also Lakota Sundance out there. And also I was active in the local Catholic parish. And so that gave me sort of the flip side to all this work I had done before. So here I was doing this thought experiment using, Western academic practices. And of course, I'm looking at post-colonialism, post-Western Christianity, but this is a Western practice looking at this question: how does Black Elk be faithful Native, faithful to his own traditions, and faithful Catholic? And I found myself doing the opposite, jumping in as a Catholic, of Catholic background, and embracing as much of indigenous tradition as I can and just seeing what happens. Because it's messy. It doesn't all just sort of fall together. You have to discern. Some things don't really go together. And it's hard to just keep this all in one place. So I would say that the biggest insight was this shift from a theoretical perspective to a native perspective of of the spirits and of ceremony. Now, we imagine Black Elk, what he was going through, and we have the benefit of all these, of hindsight and of seeing all these big, huge global systems and analyzing them. And that's true. And Black Elk could see some of those things. But his primary mode of encountering Christianity was the spirits and ceremony. In the ghost dance, the last major vision of his life, he had a vision of Christ. And in a native tradition, particularly in Lakota tradition, when a spirit manifests itself to you, it does so to give you a gift and to issue a call. I mean, you can see echoes of this, of course, in the Bible as well. But when you see the spirit, you also become the spirit, and you do things in the manner of the spirit. So if an eagle visits you, you are called to heal in the way of an eagle, and you are that eagle for the rest of your life. And you have to enact that and reciprocate that call in ceremony. That's a requirement. And so just like with his great vision, Black Elk, he was given a call. He put it off for almost a decade until he finally gave in, told his elders, and he went to ceremony and became a healer. And that's, if you look at his biography and how he interacted with this vision of Christ, he put it off. You can very much read his baptism as that, a native ceremony in which he embraces a call to use the power given to him by the Spirit. Now, Christ was seen in the ghost dance, and then also the Catholic world and other Christian traditions, they translated his name Wanikia, he who makes live. That the defining characteristic, the defining power of Christ was this ability to renew the world. And so that was the gift that was given to Black Elk, and that's what he embraced, I think, in his Catholic life, and not at the expense of his previous call, but in continuity with his previous call. So anyway, that is something that I never could have seen without participating in this, and I think is really the fundamental perspective for measuring the sincerity of Black Elk's Christian life. Because there's one thing you do not do in a native context, or there's lots of things, but you don't mess with the spirit world. You don't fool around with ceremony. That's not something you lie about. Ceremony is the foundation of native life, and if there's one thing you respect, it's that.
That's cool. That's great to hear more about how that, really formative experience of actually living in a native community helped you rethink some of this, and helped you sort of shed some new light on Black Elk. Well, our time is quickly coming up to an hour, and I don't like that at all. I don't like how time is working right now. I wish it would slow down a little bit.
Same here.
But yeah, something I would like to hear you talk about, something I'm really interested in for a lot of reasons, is the cause for Black Elk's canonization. Something that Basil Braveheart talked a bit about last week, and something I'd love to hear your take on as well. So what does that case look like so far? What do you think formally recognizing Black Elk as a saint would mean for the Catholic Church, especially in the United States?
So I won't go into the detail because listeners can go and find that pretty easily, but you can just say that it's about halfway done, and all the signs that I see are very positive, and I'm very surprised by that. If you had asked me this a couple years ago, I would have said this has no chance, because there are going to be people, a segment of the church that would say, no way, this guy is too pagan. Because he was very involved in revitalizing Lakota tradition after his baptism in Catholic life. And I thought that people would find that threatening. And I really haven't heard any voices. There's been a number of people who I would expect to say something like that who have not, have been very positive and affirming of it. And some even saying things that I would have been hesitant to say for fear of being perceived as too radical or outside of legitimate conversation about, sainthood. I think it would be an important affirmation of Native Catholics who are doing, what Black Elk did, which is participating in two worlds very sincerely. and they've never been recognized in that way. You know, Saint Kateri, other Native saints, very clearly had to step outside of their religious practices, and Black Elk would be the first one who still inhabited religious practices, but in a faithful way to the overall gospel message, I think. And I think it's a really historic moment for indigenous Christianity in general. You know, Christians tend to look at natives as a justice issue, right? So, oh, wow, yep, we did some really bad things. Natives are suffering. We've got to fix that. You know, that's true. Or they kind of interact with indigenous tradition as an alternative to Christian faith. Like they come across the history. Wow, how did this happen? Oh, it might be Christianity. Well, they have some cool traditions. Maybe that is something better. I think this is really the first time where I'm encountering a significant number of Christians who are realizing that indigenous traditions, spiritual traditions, can offer something to their faith, give them something that's missing, and help them to step outside of a lot of the problematic categories of Western Christianity. And, you know, I want to give just a quick shout out to a group that has been doing this work for a while. NATES used to stand for North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies. It's a group of Native Christians who for about 15 years have been trying to think this out. Okay, what does it mean to be committed Christians but thoroughly inhabit an indigenous world? There's a lot of insights that come out of that. And I think that now there are spaces in which average people are beginning to explore that possibility.
Yeah, it's really, I think, an amazing thing as well. Like to try to imagine what it would mean to recognize someone like Black Elk as a saint formally in the Catholic Church would just have to cause people to reevaluate somewhat. Obviously, it wouldn't decolonize the church in the United States or Canada by any stretch, but it would create some problems, I would think, like good, important problems. You know, it would hopefully make some Catholics at least sort of question the way in which Catholicism is tied to white supremacy and settler colonialism so often in the United States. I guess there's so much I would love to hear more about. I mean, we spent so much time kind of talking a little bit about your own study, and I want to encourage people, despite the things you might change now anyway, to look at it, especially for all the really fascinating ways that you do account for Black Elk and his Catholicism. You draw from so many diary entries and letters and reflections by his family, and I think that's all extremely useful. And I wonder, maybe as we close here, maybe you could talk a bit about some of those relationships that you have and how they've opened up your work on Black Elk, and maybe specifically Basil, Braveheart. We opened the episode talking a little bit about that, but it's clear that he's been a formative influence on you, and as you're trying to work this out, he's clearly been significant in your own pursuits too. So what has that relationship opened up for you, thinking through Lakota Catholicism, and I guess what do you think? How can I phrase this? Like, how do you think that those kinds of relationships will continue to inform your work, I guess?
Well, I should say, first of all, like on a personal level, he's one of the most genuine, centered people that I know, and he's also doing some of the most interesting theological work of anybody I've encountered. The kind of worlds he's trying to bring together, and he's integrated the Lakota and Catholic ways in a deeper way than anybody else that I've encountered. And for me, I think as academics, we drift towards inhabiting the tools we use rather than the content we're thinking about, like getting wrapped up in our theory so much that we kind of lose the center. And Braveheart, he continually opens up a much deeper spiritual realm, and I'm better off spiritually, I think, because of his willingness to share his own journey. With regard to Black Elk, I'm so much more capable of appreciating how profoundly rooted he was in Lakota tradition. It's the kind of thing you can be aware of on an intellectual level, but when you're looking for compatibility with a different tradition like Catholicism, it's easy to just see the Lakota part as a cognate, or only important in as much as it reflects what's going on in the Catholic world. And the ongoing conversation with him has helped me to appreciate, almost the reverse, that there is this deep ocean of Lakota spirituality that is not exhausted by whatever commonalities you find in Catholicism, and that should wash back over the church and provide new resources for renewal. And I think he's helped me think about the way I do theology. When we get it wrapped up in debates like Black Elk's identity, we get so wrapped up in the outcome, and working out our own hangups. You sort of unconsciously try and assert a type of ownership over the material. You kind of, whether you know it or not, drift into like a caricature of some sports radio guy firing off hot takes and taking down the universe. And that's not what this is about. I've been trying to work my way out of that for a while, and talking to Braveheart has really helped shatter that for me, I think, and realize that Nicholas Black Elk is a living presence rooted first and foremost in the Lakota people. And it's not about winning arguments, but being about, able to collaborate with a very diverse group of people with different foci, with different interests in Black Elk, but to be collaborators in search of truth for the common good. And I think that's what Black Elk was known for in his life. He was a genuine bridge builder, and whose unquestionable holiness, he permeated his interactions with everyone. So just trying to be a better ambassador of his legacy. And I guess in closing, I'd also add that you and your guests, are important mentors for me in that process as well. Being a part of your community that you created and sustained has really shaped me in a positive way to inhabit this theological study in a good way, and not just, trying to have success in it, but to really be a virtuous person within that. So thank you for sharing that with me.
Well, it's very kind of you to say.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do feel like we're like podcasting into the void, so that's always a good, encouraging note. Well, thanks so much, Damian, for joining us. I mean, it's just been a pleasure to learn a little bit more. I read Black Elk Speaks in high school and have not thought about it since then. So this was a really helpful thing to kind of think through. Thanks so much again. And the book is called Black Elk, Colonialism and Lakota Catholicism from Orbis. Really thankful for your research and looking forward to seeing what's on the horizon for you.
Well, thanks again for taking a chance on me in this topic, which, I guess there's some leftist politics involved, but I think you really expanded your definition to include me, and I'm really appreciative of that, and to be able to interact with you as well.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can go give us an iTunes review. You got to do it. It's mandatory now. You can also support us on Patreon. We really appreciate that. If you responded to our Patreon poll a while back about those enamel pins, guess what? Your pin's on its way. It's in the mail. So keep a lookout for it. It'll probably be there in a while because the mail is slow.
Put it on your cool messenger bag or your punk jackets and send us a picture.
Oh, definitely send us a picture of those punk jackets. Love that. Cool. Also, you should check out the other two podcast networks that we're on because they're full of great shows about very similar topics. We're on Theology Corner and we're also on Critical Mediations. Both of those networks have lots of cool stuff on them. Go and check them out. for people who really know how to read the Bible and talk about God, but not us. Our music, our intro music is by Amari Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. See you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.